In today's America, there are only a few pizza restaurants as iconic as Chuck E. Cheese. The brand has stayed with Americans since the 80s, and even today, despite everything, the restaurant remains one of the go-to destinations for kids who just want to eat pizza and play games. However, before all of that, there was Showbiz Pizza Place, and after that, there was the pizza war that ended up destroying the original Chuck E. Cheese. What makes this even more remarkable is that Chuck E. Cheese was destroyed by a company that was imitating their business model. After Chuck E. Cheese lost the pizza war of the mid-80s, they ended up being bought by the company they had lost the war to. This is the story of Chuck E. Cheese and the war they won, but lost. But before we go on, this is Munchable, and we want you guys to like, subscribe, and smash the notifications button. It really helps us continue bringing interesting stories to life. So, where do we start? At the very beginning, of course. In the beginning, Chuck E. Cheese was never meant to be a regular company. In fact, the founder of the company, Nolan Bushnell, wasn't particularly interested in either Chuck's or E's or cheese or pizza. He was primarily a tech man. That is, he made electronic games, and he was quite successful at making these games too. In fact, he was so successful that by 29 he'd already founded his own video game company called ATARI. At ATARI, Bushnell sold video games, and he was making a great living through that until he discovered something. He was selling these huge video game machines for about $2,000 to pizza restaurants, and they ended up making about $20,000 over the course of their lives. Nolan figured that there was a bigger slice of the metaphorical profit pizza just there for the taking, and he decided that he was going to do something about it. He figured that if he founded a restaurant chain that would be able to reasonably combine the atmosphere of an arcade center with the deliciousness of good food, he'd be making a whole lot more money than he was at that moment. And to an extent, Nolan was right. He went about setting up his new business. And as he was thinking of the logistics, an idea popped into his head. He figured that his restaurant would have to stand out in some way. It just couldn't be some restaurant with an arcade. That wouldn't stand out. There needed to be something more, something extra, something edgy. And soon enough, Bushnell came up with the idea of animatronics. If you didn't know, animatronics are basically mechatronic puppets. And while they may be quite popular today, they used to be a novelty. Bushnell's big idea was that he would combine animatronics with good food in an arcade. That way, he'd be able to cash out on both the profits from food and the lifetime profits of arcade games, which was his motive in the first place. That's why Bushnell made sure that his new restaurant was basically a division of the game company. The new restaurant was basically an excuse for ATARI to make more money. However, the company would eventually grow to be bigger than ATARI could have ever imagined. Now that Bushnell had the idea for his new restaurant down, what remained was the choice of food. He knew that the food would have to be something that children loved, and it had to take some time to prepare so that the children would play the installed arcade games while they waited for their meals. The obvious choice that fulfilled all these requirements was pizza, and the idea was solidified. There was another good reason why Bushnell chose pizza. He figured that making good pizza would be easy. If the dough, cheese, and sauce were good, it would be incredibly difficult to mess the entire show up. But he would learn that in the next decade, it was incredibly hard to run a successful pizza restaurant, and it was quite easy to mess everything up and lose his business to a competitor. Bushnell soon got a place in San Jose, set everything up, and decided to name the place Coyote Pizza. That's why Bushnell ordered for animatronics that looked like coyotes before the restaurant's opening night. However, the order was messed up, and the animatronics looked like rats instead. This led to Bushnell thinking of changing the restaurant's name to, wait for it, Rick Rat's Pizza. Thankfully, he changed his mind at the last minute and went with Chuck E. Cheese instead. And that's how Chuck E. Cheese was founded. The launch was successful, and by the next year, Bushnell was pushing Time Warner, the corporate parent of ATARI, to open more locations of Chuck E. Cheese. The executives over at Time Warner didn't think this was a clever idea. and thus they gave Bushnell an offer he couldn't refuse. They would sell ATARI to him for $500,000, and he would be free to do whatever he wanted with the company. Bushnell took the deal and made the entire company his own. By 1975, Chuck E. Cheese was already expanding faster than Bushnell could imagine. That same year, he entered an agreement with Robert Brock Topeka in management. That's a mouthful. The agreement was simple. Brock would invest cash into Chuck E. Cheese, and he would have the rights to open his own outlets all around the country. However, Brock didn't see out the terms of the agreement. He heard of a man named Aaron Fetcher who'd created better-looking animatronics, and he decided that he would create his own chain of restaurants without Bushnell. The logic was simple. Brock only needed Bushnell for his animatronics, but with Fetcher, he could start something entirely different with better-looking animatronics. So Brock ran off with Fetcher to create their own company, and they were successful. The company was named Showbiz Pizza Place, Inc., and it was basically the same thing as Chuck E. Cheese. The only difference was that the animatronics were better, as they were made by Fetcher. Quickly tell us, what would you have done if you were in Brock's shoes? Would you have stuck with Bushnell, or would you go start your own thing with Fetcher? Let us know in the comments section. In 1980, Showbiz Pizza Place opened its first outlet, and business was launched. However, Bushnell wasn't going to take this apparent theft of Chuck E. Cheese's business model lying down. He sued Brock, and the court mandated that Brock's Showbiz Pizza Place give Chuck E. Cheese a tiny percentage of their profits for the next 14 years. That year marked the start of a battle of domination between Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza Place. Both companies were expanding rather rapidly, and they started establishing outlets in the same town. Sadly, Bushnell made a grave mistake. He expanded too quickly and opened too many outlets too soon, and this meant that he was getting terrible locations and that his company was starting to bleed funds. But even at that, things were still going pretty well. However, the video game crash of 1983 resulted in enormous losses for Chuck E. Cheese. In fact, by the end of the year, the company had lost about $15 million. By 1984, the company had become so deep in debts that it was struggling to stay afloat. Sadly, that year Bushnell had to bite the bullet and file for bankruptcy. Surprisingly, as Chuck E. Cheese was going under, Showbiz Pizza Place was consolidating. In fact, Showbiz Pizza Place became so successful that the company was able to purchase Chuck E. Cheese the next year. And that's how an imitator of Chuck E. Cheese beat the original at its own game and eventually went on to own the entire thing. After the merger, both companies continued to operate as separate entities, but under the same umbrella. However, after 1990, Showbiz Pizza Place decided to take on the more widely accepted Chuck E. Cheese name brand, and both companies merged into one true mega brand. In 1998, the holding company that held ownership of both brands changed its name to CEC Entertainment to truly reflect the Chuck E. Cheese brand. Now, the obvious question is this: where's Bushnell these days? After selling Chuck E. Cheese to his biggest competitor and biggest imitator, where did he go? Well, he resigned from Chuck E. Cheese and went on to have a dignified career in the world of tech because, as you know, he was a tech man. Perhaps the lesson to be learned here is that building and sustaining a business isn't the easiest thing in the world, and if you aren't genuinely in love with it, you shouldn't do it. That's it for today, guys. Tune in every week for amazing stories about your favorite food brands.